The story begins with a mother who never fit into society's neat expectations. She was loud, fearless, and unapologetically herself, a flamboyant California biker wrapped in leather, attitude, and defiance. This woman, Florence Rusty Tullis, raised a little boy named Roy Lee Dennis, whom everyone called Rocky. From the outside, their life looked like something out of a dramatic film. A wild mother, a fragile child, and a cruel disease that slowly transformed the boy's face into something the world struggled to understand. Many people think they already know this story because of the famous 1980s movie inspired by their lives. But the truth, especially what Rusty revealed later, is far more complicated, raw, and human than anything Hollywood showed. Rocky Dennis was born on December 4th, 1961, in Glendora, California. As a baby, he earned his nickname because he would not sleep unless someone rocked him constantly. At first, he seemed like any other child, though he was often sick with ear infections and sinus problems. Nothing about those early years hinted at the devastating diagnosis that would come. When he was around 2 years old, he went to the hospital for a routine tonsillectomy. During that visit, an X-ray technician noticed something unusual about the shape of his skull. That observation triggered months of tests, hospital visits, and uncertainty. Rusty found herself traveling repeatedly to UCLA Medical Center, searching for answers that doctors struggled to provide. Eventually, the diagnosis arrived with words that sounded almost impossible to pronounce: craniodiaphyseal dysplasia. It was a disease so rare that at the time only a handful of cases had ever been documented worldwide. The condition caused abnormal calcium buildup in the skull, making the bones thicken and expand. As the skull grew heavier and more distorted, it would push the facial features outward, compress the brain, and gradually destroy vision and hearing. Doctors told Rusty that her son would likely become blind, severely disabled, and would not live past the age of 7. For most parents, such news would have shattered every hope. But Rusty Dennis was not most parents. Instead of surrendering to grief, she reacted with defiance. She refused to accept that her child's life would be defined by medical predictions. She believed deeply that the mind had power over the body, that people could influence their own health through sheer will. Whether that belief was comforting or unrealistic depended on who you asked, but for Rusty, it became the foundation of how she raised Rocky. When he complained of pain, she encouraged him to fight it mentally. When others pitted him, she pushed him to act like any other kid. She did not want him growing up thinking he was fragile or doomed. As Rocky grew older, the physical effects of the disease became impossible to hide. His face changed shape, his features thickened, and strangers often stared or reacted with shock. Yet those who spent time with him quickly discovered a boy who was warm, funny, and incredibly resilient. Rusty fought constantly to keep him in mainstream schools. Administrators worried about his eyesight and suggested special education classes, but she insisted he was intellectually capable. She believed the resistance came more from other parents' discomfort than from Rocky's abilities. Her stubbornness paid off. Rocky not only kept up academically, but developed a reputation as kind, witty, and determined. Behind that fierce advocacy was a woman with a turbulent past. Rusty had grown up in Brooklyn, New York, in a working-class Jewish family. She had been rebellious from an early age, clashing with authority and rejecting conventional paths. By her early teens, she had already dropped out of school and was running with motorcycle crowds. Her life moved quickly: early marriage, motherhood, divorce, and eventually a move to California. By the time Rocky was born, she had already lived a lifetime of chaos and reinvention. That history shaped her approach to parenting. She did not trust institutions easily, and she had no patience for anyone who tried to limit her son's future. Rusty's social circle was equally unconventional. She was part of a motorcycle group known as the Turks, a tight-knit community of bikers who valued loyalty above all else. To outsiders, they looked intimidating, but to Rocky, they became an extended family. These rough, leather-clad adults treated him with affection and acceptance, never making him feel like an outsider. In their presence, he was not the sick kid. He was simply Rocky. Their world was loud, chaotic, and unconventional, but it gave him something many people with visible differences never receive: unconditional belonging. Despite her wild lifestyle, Rusty was fiercely devoted to her son. She pushed doctors to consider possibilities rather than limitations. She challenged teachers to see Rocky's intelligence rather than his appearance. She encouraged him to dream about the future, even when medical reality suggested he might not have one. To her, hope was not optional, it was a form of resistance. She believed that as long as Rocky refused to see himself as dying, he would continue to live fully. This approach created a childhood that was both extraordinary and complicated. Rocky learned to face the world with courage, but he also learned to suppress fear and pain. Rusty's philosophy demanded strength, sometimes at the cost of vulnerability. Yet their bond was undeniable. They laughed together, argued fiercely, and navigated a world that often did not know how to respond to them. To neighbors and classmates, they were unforgettable: the biker mother and the boy with the distorted face who refused to hide. Years later, when filmmakers told their story, audiences saw an inspiring tale of love and resilience. But Rusty would later say that the movie captured only part of the truth. It softened the chaos, simplified the contradictions, and turned a complicated life into something easier to digest. The real story, according to her, was messier, harsher, and ultimately more powerful. It was not just about a brave boy facing a disease. It was about a mother who refused to accept limits, a family built from unlikely pieces, and a life lived loudly in the face of inevitability. And that is where the legend truly begins. Not with the film, not with the fame, but with a rebellious mother and a determined child who chose to live on their own terms, even when the world expected them to quietly prepare for the end. As Rocky moved into his teenage years, it became clear that he had already defied every prediction doctors had made about him. He could see, he could think clearly, and he had developed a personality so vibrant that people often forgot about his condition once they got to know him. His face, however, continued to change. The bones of his skull kept thickening, pushing his features outward and altering his appearance in ways that made strangers uncomfortable. Children sometimes stared. Adults sometimes looked away too quickly. Rocky learned early that the world could be cruel without intending to be. Yet he refused to respond with bitterness. Instead, he leaned into humor, kindness, and a quiet confidence that disarmed people. Rusty encouraged that attitude. She taught him never to hide, never to apologize for existing, and never to let anyone define him by his condition. She insisted he attend public school, join activities, and build friendships like any other teenager. It wasn't easy. There were moments when administrators suggested separate arrangements, worried that he would struggle academically or socially. Rusty pushed back every time. She believed fiercely that isolation would do more damage than the disease itself. Her goal was simple: Rocky would live a normal life for as long as he could. And in many ways, he did. He became known at school for his warmth and sense of humor. He made friends easily and even tutored classmates who were struggling, charging a small fee that he negotiated himself. That detail alone revealed something important about him. He did not want charity. He wanted independence and respect. Teachers described him as thoughtful and determined. Classmates remembered how he could make people laugh within minutes. He was not the tragic figure strangers expected. He was a teenager navigating life, friendships, and dreams just like anyone else. Rusty watched all of this with pride, but also with a growing awareness that time might still be limited. The headaches that had followed Rocky since childhood became more intense as he grew older. Sometimes they were so severe that he had to lie down in a dark room for hours. Doctors could offer little relief. The disease was relentless, pressing inward as much as it pushed outward. Rusty continued to rely on her philosophy of mental strength, urging him to fight through pain whenever possible. She believed that focusing on illness would only give it more power. At home, their life remained unconventional but full of energy. The biker community that surrounded them continued to play a central role. These men and women, who might have seemed intimidating to outsiders, treated Rocky like a younger brother or nephew. They took him on outings, joked with him, and never allowed him to feel like he was fragile. Their loyalty to Rusty extended naturally to her son. In their world, differences were not weaknesses. They were simply part of who someone was. That acceptance helped shape Rocky's confidence and his refusal to feel ashamed of his appearance. Despite the support around him, Rocky was not immune to loneliness. As he entered adolescence, he began to notice the things he might never experience. Dating a typical future, the simple anonymity of blending into a crowd. Yet he rarely spoke about those fears openly. Instead, he poured his energy into learning and exploring whatever fascinated him. He developed a deep interest in astronomy, memorizing constellations and facts about the night sky. Looking upward gave him a sense of perspective. The universe was vast, mysterious, and indifferent to human judgments about appearance. One of the most meaningful experiences of his teenage years came during a summer camp for young people with medical challenges. There, he met others who understood what it meant to live with visible differences or chronic illness. Among them was a blind girl with whom he formed a close bond. She could not see his face, which meant she experienced him without the filter of appearance. Their connection was based entirely on personality, conversation, and shared vulnerability. For Rocky, it was proof that relationships did not have to be defined by how someone looked. Meanwhile, Rusty's own life remained complex. She balanced fierce devotion to her son with personal struggles that she never fully hid. She continued to live loudly, surrounded by friends, motorcycles, and a lifestyle that many would consider chaotic. Critics sometimes questioned her choices, wondering whether her environment was suitable for a child with such serious health issues. But those who knew them understood that Rocky did not need a quiet, sterile life. He needed joy, laughter, and a sense that he belonged somewhere without conditions. As Rocky approached 16, subtle changes signaled that his body was reaching its limits. His mobility decreased, and the headaches grew more frequent. He began using a wheelchair during particularly difficult periods. Rusty noticed the decline, but refused to let despair take over. She had spent years proving the doctors wrong, and she clung to the hope that they might still be wrong again. Denial, faith, stubbornness, whatever name one gave it, it was the force that had carried them this far. During this time, Rocky continued to express curiosity about the future. He talked about possibilities rather than limitations. When doctors discussed experimental treatments or surgeries that might alter his appearance, he responded with surprising clarity. He wondered aloud who he would be if his face changed. Would he still recognize himself? Would others treat him differently in ways that felt dishonest? Those questions revealed a maturity beyond his years. He had spent his life learning that identity was more than appearance, and he was not eager to lose that hard-earned understanding. Rusty listened to these conversations with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. She knew her son was facing questions no teenager should have to consider. Yet she also saw in him a resilience that amazed everyone who met him. He did not measure his life by its length, but by its intensity. Every friendship, every joke, every small victory mattered because nothing was guaranteed. By the late 1970s, the tension between hope and reality had become impossible to ignore. Rocky had already lived nearly a decade longer than doctors predicted, but the disease was advancing. Rusty sensed that they were entering a final chapter, though she never said it aloud. Instead, she doubled down on the belief that had guided them from the beginning. Live fully today, because tomorrow was uncertain for everyone, not just them. What neither of them could know was how quickly the end would come, or how the details of those final days would later be transformed, softened, and reshaped by storytellers. The world would eventually see an emotional, dramatic version of their lives on screen. But the real moments, the quiet fears, the stubborn hope, the ordinary evenings filled with laughter, belonged only to them. Their story was not just about illness or survival. It was about how two people chose to face the world together, refusing to let tragedy define every moment. And as the final weeks approached, That bond between mother and son became both their greatest strength and their deepest vulnerability. By the fall of 1978, the long battle that had defined Rocky's entire life was reaching its final stage. He was 16 years old, an age he was never supposed to see. For years, Rusty had treated every birthday as a victory, proof that determination and love could bend fate, at least temporarily. But now the disease was advancing faster than hope could keep up. Rocky's body was exhausted. The headaches that once came and when had become constant, pounding reminders that the pressure inside his skull was increasing. His strength faded, and the energetic boy who once refused to slow down now needed help simply moving from room to room. Despite the physical decline, his spirit remained remarkably intact. Friends who visited during those weeks remembered how he still cracked jokes and tried to comfort others instead of focusing on his own suffering. That was always his way, turning attention outward so people would not worry. Rusty watched this with pride and quiet fear. She had spent years convincing herself that he would somehow keep beating the odds, but she could no longer ignore the reality unfolding in front of her. In those final weeks, Rocky relied more heavily on a wheelchair. The headaches often forced him to lie down in a darkened room, where even small noises felt overwhelming. Rusty stayed close, maintaining the same routine she had followed throughout his life. She encouraged him to stay strong, to believe he could push through the pain, just as he always had. To outsiders, this might have looked like denial. To Rusty, it was consistency, the only way she knew how to fight something she could not control. On October 3rd, 1978, the family decided to go out to dinner together. It was not framed as a farewell or a special occasion, just an attempt to have a normal evening. Those who were there later recalled how fragile Rocky seemed, how every movement appeared to cost him energy. Yet he insisted on going, determined not to let illness steal one more ordinary experience. They shared a meal, conversation, and a sense of togetherness that felt almost peaceful. No one wanted to say what they were all thinking, that this might be one of the last times they would sit together like this. When they returned home, Rocky complained of a severe headache. Rusty responded the way she always had. She told him to go to his room and rest, to focus on making himself feel better. It was advice she had given him countless times before, rooted in her belief that the mind could influence the body. For years, he had followed that instruction and eventually emerged smiling, ready to continue with his day. That night, however, was different. The pain was deeper, heavier, and unrelenting. Rocky went to bed and fell asleep. By morning, he was gone. He died in his sleep on October 4th, 1978, at home, just weeks before his 17th birthday. There were no hospital machines, no sterile rooms, no frantic last-minute interventions. Rusty had always promised him that he would not die surrounded by tubes and strangers, and in that sense, she kept her promise. He passed away in the place where he had lived, surrounded by the world that had accepted him exactly as he was. The aftermath was surreal. For Rusty, the loss was both devastating and strangely quiet. She had spent so many years preparing herself for the possibility that it almost felt unreal when it finally happened. Grief did not arrive as a single overwhelming wave, but as a series of moments. Seeing his empty room, hearing silence where laughter used to be, realizing there would be no more birthdays to celebrate defiantly. Friends from the biker community gathered around her, offering the only kind of support they knew: presence, loyalty, and shared memories. In the years that followed, Rocky's story began to spread beyond their immediate circle. People who had known him spoke about his kindness and courage. Medical professionals referenced his case as an example of survival beyond expectation. Eventually, filmmakers and writers became interested, seeing in his life a powerful narrative about resilience and unconditional love. Rusty agreed to share their story, believing it might inspire other families facing impossible diagnoses. When the movie was released in the mid-1980s, audiences were deeply moved. Many saw it as a tribute to Rocky's courage and Rusty's unconventional devotion. But as the attention grew, Rusty began to feel that something essential had been lost in translation. The film captured the broad strokes, the disease, the love, the struggle, but it also simplified the chaos, the contradictions, and the harsher truths. Real life had been messy and unpredictable. On screen, it became structured, dramatic, and easier to understand. She later described the film as a kind of fairy tale, not because it was entirely false, but because it softened the rough edges. The timing of events was compressed, certain people were left out, and some painful realities were adjusted for emotional impact. Rusty did not resent the filmmakers or the actors. In fact, she appreciated the effort to honor her son, but she wanted people to understand that the real story was not just inspirational. It was complicated, flawed, and deeply human. One omission that bothered her was the absence of her older son, Joshua, from the narrative. His life and struggles have been intertwined with Rocky's, yet he was written out of the cinematic version. For Rusty, this was a reminder that storytelling often requires choices that erase parts of reality. She understood why it happened, but it still felt like losing a piece of the truth. The attention surrounding the film also brought financial realities into focus. Rusty had received a relatively small payment for the rights to the story, especially compared to the movie's success. Much of that money went toward medical care for Joshua, who was facing his own life-threatening illness. In that sense, she had traded one son's story to try to save another. It was a decision rooted in love, not profit, but it added another layer of complexity to an already complicated life. As interviews and public appearances continued, Rusty remained unapologetically herself. She spoke bluntly, praised what she felt was accurate, and criticized what was not. She refused to become a sentimental figure or a symbol of perfect motherhood. She insisted that she had simply done what she thought was right, even when it meant making mistakes. Her honesty surprised people who expected a softer, more polished narrative. Through it all, one thing remained clear. Rocky's life had changed everyone who encountered it. He had lived longer than anyone predicted, loved more deeply than many people manage in a lifetime, and left behind a legacy that could not be contained within a single film or story. Rusty carried that legacy forward in her own unpredictable way, continuing to challenge expectations and refuse easy labels. The world would remember Rocky as an inspiration, a symbol of courage in the face of unimaginable hardship. Rusty remembered him simply as her son, stubborn, funny, brave, and impossible to forget. And as her own life moved into its later chapters, she would continue to speak about him not with polished sentiment, but with the same raw honesty that had defined their journey from the very beginning. After Rocky's death, Rusty Dennis faced a silence that no amount of toughness could completely shield her from. For years, her entire life had revolved around protecting, encouraging, and fighting for her son. Without him, she had to rediscover who she was beyond being Rocky's mother. Grief changed her, but it did not erase her defiant nature. Instead of withdrawing from the world, she eventually redirected her energy toward helping others who were struggling with illness, loss, and addiction. It was as if she needed to keep moving forward because standing still meant facing too much pain at once. She moved to San Francisco, a city that matched her unconventional spirit. There, she explored Buddhism and became involved in counseling work, particularly with people battling substance use and those facing terminal illness. The woman who had once lived chaotically among biker gangs began building something quieter, more reflective. Yet she never abandoned her identity completely. She still rode motorcycles, still spoke bluntly, and still rejected society's expectations of how a grieving mother should behave. Her life became a strange balance between compassion and rebellion. During this period, Rusty also endured another devastating loss. Her older son, Joshua, whom the movie had largely left out of the story, became seriously ill during the height of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. He was a writer living in San Francisco, openly gay, and deeply connected to his mother despite their differences. Rusty supported him through his illness, just as fiercely as she had supported Rocky. She used much of the money she had received from the film rights to cover his medical expenses, hoping against hope that he might survive. But in 1987, Joshua died at the age of 32. Losing both of her children might have broken someone else completely. Rusty, however, continued forward, carrying her grief like a weight she refused to let crush her. In interviews over the years, she spoke about death in a way that startled people. She did not describe it as an ending, but as another destination, another place to go. It was a perspective shaped by years of facing the inevitable. She often said she did not believe in death in the traditional sense, insisting that the people she loved were simply elsewhere. Whether this belief came from faith, denial, or survival instinct did not matter. It allowed her to keep living without being consumed by sorrow. As time passed, the story of Rocky Dennis remained part of public memory, largely because of the film that had introduced him to millions. Rusty continued to remind people that the Real story was more complicated than what they had seen on screen. She emphasized that Rocky had not wanted pity and that his life had been full of ordinary moments, school, friendships, arguments, laughter, not just tragedy. She wanted people to remember him as a whole person, not a symbol. Her own life continued in unpredictable ways. She maintained connections with the biker community that had once been her extended family, while also engaging in counseling and charitable work. Those who met her during these years described a woman who could be both warm and intimidating, compassionate and brutally honest. She did not pretend to have all the answers. She simply shared what she had learned from surviving experiences most people could not imagine. In October 2006, when she was 70 years old, Rusty was involved in a serious motorcycle accident. She was riding her three-wheeled bike when mechanical failure caused her to lose control. The crash left her with severe injuries, including broken legs and a punctured lung. Even then, she survived the initial trauma, demonstrating the same stubborn resilience that had defined her entire life. But complications followed, and her body could not fully recover. On November 11, 2006, Florence Rusty Tullis died in a hospital in California. Her death closed a chapter that had been anything but ordinary. She had lived as a rebel, a mother, a fighter, and a woman who refused to accept easy narratives about strength or weakness. She never transformed into a saintly figure or cautionary tale. Instead, she remained exactly what she had always been: complicated, flawed, fiercely loving, and unapologetically herself. Looking back, the legacy of Rocky and Rusty Dennis is not just about illness or inspiration. It is about the messy reality of human lives that do not fit into simple categories. Rocky showed that courage can exist without bitterness, that a person can face unimaginable hardship and still choose kindness. Rusty showed that love does not always look gentle or conventional. Sometimes it looks loud, stubborn, and imperfect. Together, they challenge society's assumptions about disability, parenting, and what it means to live fully when time is uncertain. Rocky lived nearly 17 years, far longer than anyone expected. In that time, he touched countless lives with his humor, intelligence, and refusal to see himself as a victim. He graduated school with honors, built friendships, fell in love, and dreamed about the future even when he knew it might be limited. He proved that a life does not have to be long to be meaningful. Rusty lived decades after his death, carrying his memory forward in her own unpredictable way. She never stopped speaking honestly about the realities they had faced. She never pretended that everything had been noble or beautiful. Instead, she offered something rarer: the truth, with all its contradictions intact. In the end, their story endures because it refuses to be simplified. It is not just a tale of tragedy or triumph, but a portrait of two people who navigated impossible circumstances with whatever tools they had. It reminds us that real lives are rarely as tidy as the versions presented on screen. They are filled with chaos, love, mistakes, resilience, and moments of unexpected grace. And perhaps that is the most powerful legacy of all. Not the movie, Not the headlines, but the reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, people can choose to live loudly, love fiercely, and leave behind a truth that no story can fully capture.